The October wind howled across the flatlands of Nebraska, carrying the scent of harvested corn and distant rain. 63-year-old Howard Brennan wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air, climbing the worn wooden ladder into the upper loft of his century-old barn. The structure had stood through 3 generations of his family, weathering countless storms and seasons, its weathered beams as familiar to him as the lines on his own calloused hands. His wife Clara had warned him that morning about the forecast, another storm system pushing in from the west, but Howard needed to check the stored wheat in the upper bins before the rains arrived. The grain had been his father's emergency supply, kept dry and protected in metal containers tucked beneath the eaves, a tradition Howard maintained even though modern farming had changed so much of their operation. He never imagined that this routine check would trap him in darkness for more than 2 weeks. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. Howard was examining the seal on one of the grain bins when he heard it, a sound like a rifle crack echoing through the barn's interior. He looked up just as a massive support beam splintered above him, decades of stress finally giving way after years of heavy snow loads and structural fatigue. The entire roof section groaned, a terrible crescendo of splitting wood and shrieking metal. Howard tried to move toward the ladder, but time seemed to collapse along with the structure. Tons of timber, corrugated metal roofing, and agricultural equipment stored in the rafters came crashing down. A crossbeam struck his left leg, spinning him sideways into a narrow gap between 2 storage bins. The world became a chaos of dust, darkness, and crushing weight. When the noise finally stopped, Howard found himself pinned in a space barely 3 feet wide, unable to move his lower body, his left leg screaming with pain beneath a massive oak beam that had been part of his grandfather's original construction. The dust settled slowly, filtering through the wreckage in grey clouds that made Howard cough and gasp for breath. He tried to call out, but his voice emerged as barely a whisper, his lungs choked with debris. Pain radiated from his trapped leg in waves that made his vision blur. He could feel something warm and wet, soaking through his jeans. Blood, he knew, though he couldn't see the injury in the nearly complete darkness. The only light came from thin cracks in the collapsed roof above him, narrow shafts where grey October sky showed through. Howard forced himself to breathe slowly, to assess his situation with the same methodical thinking that had guided him through 50 years of farming. His right arm was free, though scraped raw. His torso was bruised but seemed intact. His left leg was completely immobilized beneath the beam, but his right leg had some movement. He tried to shift the beam, straining with whatever leverage he could manage in the confined space, but it wouldn't budge. Easily 800 pounds of solid oak, part of a structure that had stood since 1927. Hours passed in the darkness, marked only by the gradual dimming of light through the cracks above. Howard called out whenever he had the strength, his voice growing hoarser with each attempt. He knew Clara would come looking for him eventually. They had been married 41 years, and she knew his routines better than he knew them himself. But the barn was set back from the main house, separated by nearly 200 yards of open ground and a windbreak of cottonwood trees. If she was inside the house, she might not hear him. If she had driven into town for groceries, as she'd mentioned that morning, she might not even know something was wrong until evening. Howard's throat was already dry from the dust, his mouth feeling like cotton. That's when he remembered the grain bins beside him. His right hand, scraped and bleeding, found the edge of the nearest container. The lid had been knocked loose in the collapse, and when he reached inside, his fingers touched the smooth, hard kernels of wheat, thousands of pounds of grain stored for emergencies, for feeding livestock during hard winters, for the kind of disaster his grandfather had always feared. Howard brought a handful of wheat to his mouth, chewing the hard kernels slowly. They were dry and difficult to swallow without water, but they were sustenance. something to keep his body functioning. He rationed himself to small amounts, knowing instinctively that he needed to conserve both the grain and his energy. As the first night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Howard could see his breath in the darkness, and he began to shiver uncontrollably. His work jacket provided some insulation, but his trapped position made it impossible to move enough to generate warmth. He forced himself to wiggle the fingers of both hands to flex his right leg, anything to maintain circulation. The pain in his left leg had evolved from sharp agony to a deep, throbbing ache that suggested serious damage. He tried not to think about infection, about blood loss, about what might be happening to the trapped limb beneath the beam. Instead, he thought about Clara, about their daughter Jennifer, who taught school in Omaha, about his grandson Bobby, who had just started kindergarten. He thought about the farm, about spring planting and fall harvests, about the rhythm of seasons that had defined his entire life. The second day brought rain, the storm Clara had warned him about. Howard heard it first as a distant rumble, then as a steady drumming on what remained of the barn's roof. Water began to drip through the cracks above him, cold drops that fell onto his face and chest. At first it was just uncomfortable, making him even colder. But then Howard realized what the rain meant: water. He positioned his head to catch the drops directly in his mouth, opening wide to capture every precious bit of moisture. When that wasn't enough, he used his free hand to guide the water into his palm, creating a small pool that he could drink from more efficiently. The rain fell for hours, soaking through his clothes, but providing the hydration his body desperately needed. He also managed to direct some of the water into an overturned metal bucket that had fallen near his reach, creating a small reservoir. It wasn't clean water. It tasted of rust and dust and old barn, but it was water, and Howard drank it gratefully, mixing it with small amounts of wheat to make the grain easier to swallow. Clara had indeed been in town that first afternoon, and when she returned to find Howard missing and the barn partially collapsed, she immediately called 911. But the destruction had been so complete, the pile of debris so massive, that first responders initially believed no one could have survived. They had found Howard's truck parked outside, his work gloves on the hood where he'd left them, but the upper section of the barn had completely caved in, creating a tangled mass of timber, metal, and machinery. The county's volunteer fire department, led by Chief Robert Jennings, organized a search effort, but after 2 days of carefully removing debris with no signs of life, no responses to their calls, they had begun to lose hope. Clara refused to give up. She stood at the edge of the wreckage site in her husband's old barn jacket, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face set with a determination that the rescue workers had learned to respect. She insisted that Howard was alive, that she could feel it, that 50 years on this farm had taught her to trust her instincts. On the 4th day of his entrapment, Howard began to hallucinate. The lack of food, the constant pain, the cold and darkness, all of it combined to make his mind drift. He saw his father standing in the wreckage, heard his mother's voice calling him in for supper. He dreamed about walking through wheat fields in summer, the grain golden and ready for harvest. But between these visions, he maintained a stubborn core of consciousness. He continued to eat small handfuls of wheat when his stomach cramped with hunger. He continued to catch rainwater whenever the storms passed over, and they came frequently that October, as if the weather itself was conspiring to keep him alive. He made noise whenever he heard sounds outside his prison, banging on the metal grain bin with a piece of debris, calling out with what remained of his voice. But the wreckage was thick, the pile of debris absorbing and deadening sound. His signals never reached the searchers working systematically through the outer layers of the collapse, and their equipment noise never penetrated deep enough for him to hear. By the end of the first week, Howard had lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together in a continuous cycle of pain, cold, brief sleep, and desperate wakefulness. His trapped leg had gone numb, which worried him more than the pain had. He knew enough about circulation and tissue damage to understand what that numbness meant, but he also knew that removing the beam without proper medical support could kill him just as surely as leaving it in place. So he waited and survived, and thought about everything that made life worth living. He thought about the first time he'd seen Clara at the county fair, her laugh bright as summer lightning. He thought about teaching Jennifer to drive a tractor, her small hands barely reaching the wheel. He thought about Bobby's last visit to the farm, how the boy's eyes had widened at the sight of the combine harvester. These memories became his lifeline, more sustaining than the wheat and rainwater that kept his body functioning. The breakthrough came on day 12. The rescue team, still working methodically through the debris at Clara's insistence, had brought in a specialized piece of excavation equipment, a compact crane with a grapple attachment designed for demolition work. The operator, a man named Vincent Carver from 3 counties over, had experience with barn collapses from the severe winter storms that had plagued the region in previous years. As the crane's grapple lifted a particularly large section of roof metal, Vincent thought he heard something, a faint, banging sound, rhythmic and deliberate. He shut down the equipment and called for silence. The entire rescue team froze, 15 volunteers and professionals holding their collective breath. Vincent cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Howard Brennan, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Then faintly but unmistakably, a response, the sound of metal being struck 3 times in quick succession. The rescue transformed from a recovery operation to a desperate race against time. Chief Jennings called in additional equipment and personnel, including a team of structural engineers from Lincoln who could assess the stability of the remaining wreckage. They couldn't simply tear into the pile. Hasty removal of debris might trigger a secondary collapse that would kill Howard instantly. Instead, they worked with agonizing slowness, removing pieces methodically, shoring up sections with temporary supports, calling down to Howard every few minutes to maintain contact. They could hear him responding now, his voice weak but present, and the sound gave them renewed energy. Clara stood at the edge of the perimeter, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white, tears streaming down her weathered face. Their daughter Jennifer had driven in from Omaha the moment she got the news, and she stood beside her mother, one arm around Clara's shoulders, both of them watching every piece of debris being lifted away. It took 14 hours of continuous work to reach Howard. The rescuers had to create a careful tunnel through the wreckage, supporting each section as they went, working by floodlights as darkness fell. When they finally broke through to the narrow space where Howard had been trapped, the sight stopped them cold. He was covered in dust and grime, his face gaunt and bearded, his eyes sunken but alert. His left leg was still pinned beneath the massive beam, the limb swollen and discolored. But he was alive. The first responder to reach him was a paramedic named Lisa Tran, a young woman who had trained for situations exactly like this, but had never actually encountered one. She squeezed through the opening and assessed Howard's condition with quick professional efficiency. His vital signs were weak but stable. The trapped leg was the critical issue. It had been compressed for 15 days, and releasing it could send a flood of toxins into his bloodstream. Lisa called for additional medical personnel and equipment. Within minutes, they had established an intravenous line, pumping fluids and medications into Howard's system to prepare his body for the trauma of release. A trauma surgeon from the regional hospital, Dr. Patrick Yu, arrived and crawled into the narrow space to assess the leg. The conversation was brief and technical, but the conclusion was clear. They needed to amputate the leg on site, right there in the wreckage, or risk Howard dying from what doctors called crush syndrome when the beam was lifted. Howard, barely conscious but still aware, made the decision himself. He told Dr. Yu to do whatever was necessary to get him out alive, to get him back to Clara and Jennifer and Bobby. His voice was barely a whisper, but his determination was absolute. The surgery took place in the worst operating room imaginable, a collapsed barn lit by portable floodlights, with a team of first responders creating a human shield around the narrow space. Dr. Yu worked with incredible precision, performing the amputation below the knee, while Lisa monitored Howard's vitals and administered medication to keep him unconscious and stable. It took 45 minutes, and every person in that rescue team would remember those minutes for the rest of their lives. When it was done, when the beam was finally lifted away and Howard was carefully extracted from his 2-week prison, a cheer went up from the assembled rescuers and volunteers. Clara was allowed through the perimeter, and she took her husband's hand as they loaded him into the waiting ambulance. He opened his eyes briefly, saw her face, and managed a smile before losing consciousness again. Howard Brennan spent 3 weeks in the intensive care unit of Great Plains Regional Medical Center. The physical recovery was brutal. Complications from dehydration, muscle breakdown, infection, and the trauma of the amputation. But he survived, just as he had survived 15 days in the darkness of his collapsed barn. The story made national news, a testament to human endurance and the power of community. The small Nebraska town had rallied around the Brennan family, with neighbors bringing food, organizing fundraisers for medical expenses, and even beginning the work of rebuilding Howard's barn. Vincent Carver, the equipment operator whose sharp ears had heard Howard's signal, visited the hospital several times, and the two men formed an unlikely friendship. When Howard was finally well enough to receive visitors beyond immediate family, he asked to see the rescue team that had saved him. Chief Jennings brought the entire crew, and Howard thanked each one personally, his voice still rough but growing stronger. He talked about the wheat that had kept him alive, about the rainwater he had caught through the cracks in the debris, about the moments when he had almost given up but chose to keep fighting. Lisa Tran, the paramedic, later said it was the defining moment of her career, proof that preparation and training could make the difference between life and death. Dr. Yu, the surgeon, noted that Howard's survival was a combination of luck, physical resilience, and sheer stubborn determination, qualities that seemed to define rural farmers across America. The investigation into the barn collapse revealed what Howard had suspected. Decades of structural stress from heavy snow loads, moisture damage to critical support beams, and the simple age of the building had combined to create a catastrophic failure. The barn had been built in 1927, and while it had been maintained, some structural elements were nearly a century old. The county building inspector noted that dozens of similar barns across Nebraska faced the same risks, aging structures that were part of the agricultural heritage, but also potential death traps. Howard's survival and rescue prompted new initiatives for barn safety inspections and retrofitting programs, turning his personal tragedy into a catalyst for broader change. 6 months after the rescue, Howard returned to his farm. He moved differently now, with a prosthetic leg and a cane, but he returned nonetheless. The new barn was smaller but modern, built to current safety codes with steel frame construction and proper load distribution. The community had contributed both labor and materials, turning the rebuilding into a collective effort that spanned weeks. On the day the new barn was completed, more than 200 people gathered for a celebration that felt part barn-raising tradition and part Thanksgiving service. Howard stood beside Clara, his arm around her waist, watching as children ran through the open space and adults admired the craftsmanship. Bobby, his grandson, tugged on his sleeve and asked about the old barn, about what it had been like to be trapped. Howard knelt down, balancing on his prosthetic leg, and told the boy a simplified version of the story, about being scared, about staying calm, about the wheat and rainwater that saved his life, about the good people who never stopped looking for him. In one corner of the new barn, Howard had created a small memorial, a display case containing a jar of wheat kernels from the bin that had sustained him, a piece of the metal roofing through which the life-saving rainwater had dripped, and photographs of the rescue team that had pulled him from the wreckage. Beside the case was a plaque with a simple inscription: "In gratitude for life, community, and second chances." Visitors to the farm often stopped to read it, to reflect on the fragility of life and the strength of human connection. For Howard, the memorial served a different purpose. It was a daily reminder that survival wasn't just about physical endurance, but about the reasons to keep fighting, the people worth surviving for, the future worth preserving. Jennifer brought Bobby to visit the farm almost every weekend after the rescue. The boy had always enjoyed farm visits, but now they took on a deeper significance. Howard taught him about agriculture and animal care, about machinery maintenance and weather prediction, but also about resilience and community. He explained how the wheat that fed livestock and made bread had kept him alive, how something as simple as rain could be the difference between survival and death. Bobby listened with the intense focus of childhood, absorbing lessons that would shape his understanding of life's value. One afternoon, as they stood in the wheat field watching the grain turn golden in the August sun, Bobby asked his grandfather if he was scared to work in the new barn. Howard considered the question carefully before answering. He admitted that yes, sometimes he was uneasy, that the memory of those 15 days in darkness still visited his dreams. But he explained that fear wasn't something to be controlled or eliminated. It was something to be acknowledged and then worked with, like the weather or the seasons. The farm continued its operations, adapted now to Howard's physical limitations. He couldn't climb ladders or operate heavy machinery the way he once had, so he hired help. Young men from neighboring farms who needed work, veterans from the county who were seeking purpose. The operation became more collaborative, less dependent on Howard's individual labor, and surprisingly, more efficient. Clara noted that her husband seemed more present somehow, more willing to delegate, more appreciative of assistance. The experience had changed him in ways both visible and subtle. The missing leg was obvious, but the internal shifts were equally significant. He spent more time with family, less time working until exhaustion. He attended more community events, strengthened relationships that he had previously taken for granted. He became an advocate for farm safety, speaking at agricultural conferences and county fairs about the importance of structural inspections and emergency preparedness. 2 years after the rescue, National Geographic featured Howard's story in a documentary about survival in extreme circumstances. The filmmakers spent a week on the farm, interviewing Howard, Clara, Jennifer, and members of the rescue team. They reconstructed the timeline of the entrapment, consulted with medical experts about how Howard had survived, and explored the broader context of agricultural accidents in America. The documentary emphasized several key factors in Howard's survival. The wheat provided essential calories and something for his digestive system to process. The rainwater prevented fatal dehydration. His methodical rationing of resources demonstrated clear thinking under stress. And his mental resilience, grounded in family connections and life purpose, kept him from giving up during the darkest moments. Doctor, you provided medical commentary explaining that Howard's baseline health as an active farmer had given him reserves that a less physically fit person might not have possessed. The broader impact of Howard's story extended beyond his personal survival. Agricultural safety organizations across the United States used his case study in training materials, emphasizing the importance of communication protocols and buddy systems when working in potentially dangerous environments. Insurance companies developed new guidelines for barn inspections and structural assessments. Several states implemented grant programs to help farmers retrofit aging structures or replace buildings that posed safety risks. Howard received dozens of letters from farmers who had conducted their own barn inspections after hearing his story, some discovering serious structural problems before catastrophe struck. He answered every letter personally, his handwriting careful and deliberate, encouraging safety while acknowledging the financial and emotional challenges of maintaining agricultural heritage. Chief Jennings retired from the volunteer fire department 3 years after the rescue, and at his retirement ceremony he spoke about the Howard Brennan case as the defining moment of his career. He described the hopelessness the team had felt after days of searching through rubble with no signs of life, the electric moment when Vincent heard that faint banging sound, and the incredible teamwork that had made the successful rescue possible. He emphasized that rural emergency response requires special skills and resources, that the volunteers who protect agricultural communities face unique challenges. The ceremony took place in the new community center, and Howard attended with his family, standing to applaud when Jennings finished his speech. Afterward, the two men embraced, an acknowledgement of the bond that forms between those who have shared life or death experiences. The wheat field behind Howard's property became particularly significant in the years following his survival. He began saving seed from that harvest, the same genetic line as the grain that had sustained him during those 15 days in darkness. He planted sections of his acreage with this particular wheat, expanding it gradually until it represented nearly a third of his total crop. He called it resilience wheat, though no official variety carried that name. When journalists asked about the designation, he explained that the name represented more than just the grain's role in his survival. It symbolized the broader resilience of agricultural communities, the way farmers adapted to hardship, the persistence required to work the land generation after generation. Some of the harvest he sold through normal channels, but he also gave seeds to other farmers, spreading the variety across the region as a living reminder of survival and community support. On the 15th anniversary of his rescue, the town held a commemoration ceremony at the farm. It wasn't something Howard had requested. In fact, he had been somewhat reluctant, uncomfortable with attention and ceremony. But Clara had worked with Jennifer to organize the event, understanding that it represented something larger than her husband's personal experience. More than 500 people attended, filling the farm's main area and spilling into the surrounding fields. The original rescue team was there, as well as representatives from agricultural safety organizations, journalists who had covered the story, and dozens of families who had been touched by Howard's example. Speakers talked about survival, community, resilience, and the importance of never giving up hope. A local high school student performed a song she had written about the rescue, her voice clear and strong in the Nebraska afternoon. When it was finally Howard's turn to speak, he walked to the microphone slowly, leaning on his cane, and stood silent for a long moment before beginning. His speech was brief, characteristic of his practical nature. He thanked the rescue team again, acknowledged the pain and fear of those 15 days while emphasizing the strength he had drawn from knowing Clara and Jennifer were looking for him. He talked about the wheat and rain, about how simple things could become miraculous when survival hung in the balance. He mentioned the moments of despair, being honest about how close he had come to giving up, but also about the choice to keep fighting. He concluded by talking about gratitude for life, for community, for the opportunity to see his grandson grow up, for mornings watching the sun rise over wheat fields. When he finished, the assembled crowd stood in silence for a moment before breaking into sustained applause. Bobby, now a teenager, stood beside his grandmother, tears streaming down his face, finally old enough to fully comprehend what his grandfather had survived and what it meant. The farm continued its operations, a working agricultural business that also served as an informal educational site. School groups occasionally visited to learn about farming and agricultural safety. Veterans organizations held events there, drawn by Howard's example of perseverance through physical and mental challenges. The memorial case in the barn expanded slightly over the years, incorporating items from other farmers who had survived agricultural accidents or near misses, creating a collective testament to resilience. Clara maintained a visitor log, and people signed from across the United States and occasionally from other countries, their comments reflecting how the story had resonated beyond its rural Nebraska origins. Some wrote about their own experiences with survival or loss. Others simply expressed gratitude for the reminder that hope and human effort could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Howard's relationship with the farm evolved in his later years. He eventually handed over day-to-day operations to a farm manager, a capable young man from town who respected the land and understood Howard's vision for sustainable agriculture. But Howard remained present, offering guidance, maintaining his morning walks through the fields when weather permitted, and continuing his role as a symbol of resilience for the community. His prosthetic leg improved over time as technology advanced, allowing him greater mobility and less discomfort. He joked sometimes that he was part man and part machine now, a 21st century farmer connected to century-old traditions. Clara remained his constant companion, and their relationship, already strong before the accident, had deepened into something that others in the community observed with quiet admiration. A partnership tempered by shared crisis and strengthened by gratitude for each additional day together. As Bobby grew older and completed his education, he surprised his family by deciding to study agricultural engineering with a focus on farm safety. He credited his grandfather's experience as the inspiration, explaining that he wanted to prevent others from facing similar ordeals. The decision delighted Howard, who saw it as the best possible legacy from his survival. That something positive and forward-looking would emerge from those dark days beneath the collapsed barn. Bobby's research and eventual career focused on developing early warning systems for structural failures in agricultural buildings, creating affordable sensor networks that could detect dangerous stress patterns before catastrophic collapse. He established a consulting practice that worked with small family farms, helping them assess and address safety concerns without the devastating financial burden that often forced families to choose between safety and economic survival. The story of Howard Brennan's survival became part of the regional folklore, told and retold with variations but always maintaining its core truth, that human resilience, simple sustenance, and community determination could overcome circumstances that seemed unsurvivable. 20 years after the rescue, the wheat field behind the barn still grew the resilience variety, and farmers across 3 states planted seed descended from those original grains. The new barn remained a landmark, and travelers on the rural highway sometimes stopped to photograph it, having read about the collapse and rescue. Howard, now in his 80s, moved more slowly but maintained his morning routine, still rising early to watch dawn break over the Nebraska plains. The farm had entered its 4th generation of family ownership, with Bobby and his wife beginning to take leadership roles, ensuring that the land and the lessons it had taught would continue forward into the future.